ACPIR extend a warm welcome to our 3 ACPIR researchers who bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise in navigating the complexities of cultural intelligence, particularly within the dynamic context of Pacific Island cultures. Today's masterclass will offer insights into cultural intelligence, how to develop your intercultural communication skills, and effective strategies for inclusion and sustainable practices for working in multicultural teams. We'll hear examples of the role of cultural intelligence, diverse teams across the Pacific. My name is Brittany McGarry, and I'm the Communications Officer with ACPIR, and I'd like to introduce our presenters. Dr. Saskia de Klerk, Discipline Lead for Marketing, International Business and Tourism at UniSC's School of Business and Creative Industries. Her extensive research portfolio focuses on advancing regional entrepreneurial ecosystems, value chains, and agribusiness innovation, emphasizing the significance of cultural difference and positionality in driving innovation and inclusive practices. In her research, Saskia considers the intricate dynamics of cultural differences and their impact on collaborative endeavors. Joining us from Viti Levu is Assistant Professor Salesh Kumar, a revered researcher in agricultural economics and agribusiness from Fiji National University. With over 3 decades of experience in the Fijian agriculture sector and beyond, Salesh's work illuminates the indispensable role of cultural intelligence in shaping research initiatives. He will share examples from his research concerning fresh produce value chains, food loss reduction, and agricultural policy across Pacific Island countries. Our third contributor, Courtney Anderson, is a PhD candidate at UniSC with a background in public health and community development. Courtney advocates for authentic engagement, partnership, and collaboration to achieve outcomes. Her PhD builds on the passion and explores partnership models between Australia and partner countries in the global south. Courtney works in multicultural teams on research relating to food systems and nutrition security in the Pacific Islands, with a focus on gender and social inclusion, capacity building, and livelihood development. Today, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat and we'll open the floor to questions at the end. Over to you. Thanks, Saskia.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Sorry, can you hear me okay? Online as well? Okay, great. Thanks, Lee. Thanks, everyone. Okay, all good to go? Oh, there's a few more joining us. Hello, welcome, come in. Okay, so I'll try and keep my eye on what's happening in the chat, but I've also got wonderful support in the room. Thank you so much. First of all, just good day, Bula Talofa, goeiedag. Thank you, ACPIR, especially Inez, Melanie, and also Brittany for your support behind the scenes. I really appreciate all the support with just getting this up and running and continuously through today as well. And it's really our pleasure to present this masterclass today. It's really an important topic to all 3 of us. And I guess some of us also felt at some stage, I need to know a little bit more. Brittany, also thank you for the introduction. I might just also mention that, as mentioned before, I'm part of the ACPIR team, maybe not as long as some of you, but it's been a real privilege to be able to support and also to develop my research in this space, specifically including more and more work in the Pacific Island space. As mentioned before, I teach international business, cross-cultural management, but also value chain and regional development as an ecosystem approach, but also looking at really looking, developing cultures and doing that in an inclusive way. So really some of the things that I'll share here today, I'm only going to skim over the basics, because it's something that I would usually teach at undergraduate level over 13 weeks, or I would do it in a 6-week condensed way for the postgrads, where we have at least 4 hours a week together. So I'm really going to try and cover some of the basics that might be useful. And hopefully there's some of these things that you find so interesting, you want us to come back and do more and maybe go a little bit deeper into some of these concepts in the future. But really my research also from the start, basically after my PhD, which is very long ago, I won't bore you with that. But it's always been with this notion of multicultural dimensions, because a lot of the problems that we have to face, you need the input from lots of different perspectives, and then also multidisciplinary, because you can't just solve most of the problems that we have to solve nowadays from only one perspective and one skill set. So a lot of the research will be around that, and it's always been, you know, a trajectory basically for me as well to develop my skills in that space. As you can hear, I speak with an accent, speak other languages too, and my mother tongue is Afrikaans. And that will tell you a little bit more about me when we get to one of the activities that I'm going to do with you today. So basically, just to tell you a little bit more about my connection with the other presenters today as well, I work with Salesh on ACPIR Food Loss in the Pacific project, where basically there's other colleagues involved as well from Samoa, Tonga, Solomon Islands, and then Fiji, where Salesh is from. And then I also work with Courtney, the third presenter today, on seaweed projects and really looking at food innovation in that space, which is very much multidisciplinary. So all three of us have a connection and we work on different projects together. So let me just, yeah, it's changing. Good. Thank you for the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land. I also want to extend that to just basically also ask you if there's anybody zooming in from somewhere else than Gabi Gabi, the Kabi Kabi people and the land on which we meet here today. If you want to share that, please share that in the chat. I just want to acknowledge also that connection with land, community, and water, and also just really pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging for that always connection to the land on which we are meeting here today. So what we will cover basically, I mentioned this before. Yeah, it's changing everywhere. That's good. It's a good start. So basically, I'll just cover off on some of the basics. As I mentioned, there's quite a lot that I can do, and you probably had quite a lot of different ideas already, or you've heard from different workshops and just maybe from your own research and investigation on what should be part of cultural intelligence or cultural development and cultural context. But I first want to just quickly go through some of the main concepts of why we need to look at cultural context. I'll touch only briefly on positionality and neuroplasticity, and then also we'll look at some of the possible strategies that you could use just as a first step to develop your knowledge, because it will always be a work in progress. And then Salesh will share his extensive experience by really providing you with some examples of how it plays out, and also his wisdom around what worked, and maybe some of the things that you could take into consideration in developing your strategies. And then Courtney will share her extensive experience through her PhD journey, emerging herself in a different culture and her insights and reflections. So basically, let's just go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm sharing a cartoon here with you just to illustrate something that we would do every day. You greet someone, and you've got certain expectations that when you meet someone for the first time, how they would reach out and interact and greet you. So just thinking about that, I've got a few people here in the room, just thinking about how would you meet someone? Would you, immediately think, okay, yes, I'm going to shake their hands, a kiss on the cheek, maybe a hug, just think about that. And those online, if you want to share how you would usually greet someone for the first time, just share that in the chat. So when you think about something basic, it's just something that we take for granted. I mean, you go somewhere and you greet someone. Already, just in this illustration, you can see 5 different ways of actually interpreting that. So with the first person, very much like what you would expect in traditional westernized settings, you know, reaching out with his one hand, could be right or left, but reaching out with his hand, wanting to shake hands. So westernized settings, but also in China, if you know someone very well, you would expect someone to have a very loose, very soft handshake as well. So that's one way to interpret greeting someone in an international arrival. So we can assume it's maybe, you know, the first time, or it looks like it's very much a business setting, business formal environment, a first time greeting. The second person in the row, basically bowing, holding a business card on the top ends of the business card face up, and also, you know, paying respect by bowing. Typically, you would expect that in Japanese culture. It's typically associated as a formal way of reaching out and providing information. And it's very much, you know, it's supposed to be a very nice looking business card that's going to also be almost like an extension of your personality and an extension of your intent. So then the third person there is basically the woman in the business suit with her suitcase. She's got the biggest one. I don't know if that's an indication of something. But she's reaching out, wanting to kiss the fourth person in the row on both cheeks, like what you would expect in a French culture or in Portugal or Spain. Very much Latin Europe would basically accept that. And the fourth person looks a bit uncomfortable, to say the least. He's trying to get out of that space, retaliating, and also maybe a bit confused when we look at his face. So definitely not something that he's accustomed to. Then we look at the poor fifth person in this row. Typically a traditional Indian or Nepalese way of greeting, with his palms together and all his fingers and a little bow. And that's also a sign of respect. But he's looking up and he's looking like, oh dear, I'm next and everybody's struggling. How am I supposed to interpret this? So this is just a way to illustrate that context really matters. When you step off that plane for the first time in a different setting and you are meeting with people, you have to have at least some idea of what this could look like. A bit of a scenario planning could work, a bit of contextual information could work. And context really matters. So little things like just greeting someone could become very complicated and could become really difficult to interpret. And you don't want to build relationships on the back foot. So miscommunication, misinterpretation, and then also you can't build trust if you don't have some idea of how to navigate the situation. So really very much important to look at this, and I use a comical illustration here, but it is quite telling that, you know, you have to do a bit of homework, you have to be aware, and you also have to think about your assumption, because most of these people actually probably got off the plane or wait there in the arrivals terminal, and they think, ah, this is how I'm going to greet, because that's what you assume would be the best way to do it. So really challenging yourself and understanding what would be appropriate. So context is central then also to communication. So we saw the illustration, you know, it's all about body language and what we can see, but very much also how we communicate, how the words we use, or what medium, the channel, whether it's email or mail or whatever we use, all the different channels available. So in terms of communication, we have to think about what's important. And if we have a bit of an understanding, like Hall, it's one of the researchers in their research in the 1990s, started to think about how can we make sense of this? It's not just, you know, reading the room, but if we have some idea of what people would be more inclined to accept as a way of effective communication. That would be really useful. So they started thinking about grouping behaviors and expected behaviors into different categories. And according to their research, they had one category of low context. So where people actually, when you send them an email, you write it up in a contract, or you say something, then that's fine. You don't need to do anything more. And most Westernized cultures would accept that as enough of a communication and enough information so that they can move forward. So especially like in Australia, you send an email, the words will mean what it means, and you can just proceed. But then you also get high context cultures where words don't carry the same weight in how you communicate. It's actually also the body language. It's actually also who's saying it, who's in the room while you are saying it. What time of the day, or how it came to be to have that discussion. So that's quite important as well. So this is maybe one thing, in that discovery process of really thinking about different cultures, one way to group it initially, and then you have to go deeper, of course, to get more context. Okay, so, and just to especially in Pacific Island or traditional dance, you'll see a lot of that, where it's so important, not just the words of the song, or not even the music. It's the tone of the music. It's the facial expressions. It's the footwork. It's the hand movements. It's the facial expressions that's going to be part of the holistic message. So it is very important to pick up on all of that, as well as the words that you are using to share the message. So that leads us to cultural assumptions. Again, I mentioned, by knowing a little bit more about how you would assume someone to greet you, or how you would think, oh, this is how it's going to play out. It's already an assumption. And what's important to know is that, you're not alone. The other person will also, or the group of people that you meet with will also have their assumptions. And it's very much also in line with what we are, exposed to growing up, what we see as this is our frame of mind. This is something that we've experienced before. So if you look at a shape like this yellow shape in the middle, it could be a swoosh, like a Nike sign. If you have exposure to Nike products, you might think, oh, yeah, that's a Nike sign. Or you could think, oh, maybe it's a moon. Or you might think about bananas. So immediately there's already an assumption. So just drawing on your own experiences, your lived experience, but also learned behaviors and exposure over time, you'll have ideas about things already in your head, and you don't even think about that. And then also you need to think about from what perspective you are looking at it. And to keep in mind that you might be looking at this picture and you see 4 logs, but the other person, from their perspective, it's definitely 3. So to really try and see it from both sides, and to take into account that for them it's real, it's 3, but for your side, from your point of view, it definitely looks like 4. But to really take that into consideration, that don't just assume because you see 4, the other person will see 4 as well. So just to keep that in mind. Okay, so I think we've established why cultural context is important. And I could go on for weeks on end, but luckily you don't have to listen to me for so long. But cultural context is really, it sets the stage. And if you've got some idea at least how to navigate or what to look out for, Erin Meyer is a very famous author from INSEAD in Paris. And she developed the culture map. And she usually refers to this cultural context as seeing the unseen or reading the room. And that's a good way of thinking about, trying to pick up, to be aware, just to be sensitive, to pick up on those things that's not said, or that's not that easily, displayed in all settings. Okay, so what's happening with my slides? I'm going backwards. Ah, there we go. Yeah, it's me. It's not the computer. Sorry. It's a human error. Okay, so that brings us to the next question. So what do we mean with culture, and to understand our positionality? And again, this could be a day. I could spend a day talking about this, and we could spend a week reflecting, and then we can spend another day coming back and talking and unpacking some of that. But what's really important here is that we know that there's lots of layers to culture. And most of the time we make judgments, or we change our behaviors to engage with someone on what we see on top of the surface. And a lot of these things, like, you know, the food that you eat, that's got cultural significance, but it's not just that. It's basically, there's a whole history of how that developed and why that food is so important. Or dances, or even, you know, when you think about arts and what's important as leisurely time spent, the family structures, all those kinds of things, it's got a history. It's got a lot of different dimensions that made that come to the surface and made that something that's absorbed in that culture. So it's important to know. You can't just read a history book necessarily. It's also good to ask questions then about that. And also to immerse yourself in the different systems available. Okay, so you must have seen this before. It's very famous, the iceberg model. And I thought, oh yeah, well, you'll expect that to be in there, so I'll show that. Okay, so that brings us, so we'll do a quick activity after this, so you'll get to do a little bit of positionality, just to start off with. But I first, before we understand, you know, the full extent of positionality, we also have to understand what neuroplasticity means. And that's the ability to learn new behaviors, to be open to actually absorb what you encounter in different cultures and different experiences. So these are actually people that go through their whole life, and they might even have experiences where they talk to others from that, you know, people that's different or from a different cultural background, but they don't take any of that on board, and it won't change them. It won't actually become part of them and take that forward. So neuroplasticity is really about your ability to learn new things, to see things that's different and absorb that and do something with that. And I'll come back to that when I go through the 4 pillars of the cultural intelligence. So really about how we think could change, or how we behave could change, or even how, you know, we think about things, and how we then, you know, communicate, or even how we develop further, what we feel should be important. It could even change your value system. So it's really important to understand that it's not just I'm born like this and I'm going to, you know, maybe leave this life like this. Neuroplasticity refers to that actual ability to change, that actual openness to want to change. Okay, so that brings us to a little activity. And I promise I didn't steal the paper. I asked our office manager if I can have a few pages, and she gave me a whole pack, and I said, no, I can't walk around like that. It would look like I'm stealing university property. So I hide it in this folder. But I wanted to give you a piece of paper. For those of you that want to do that on your laptops, that's fine. And for those of you online, if you've got a piece of paper close by, maybe just drag that closer, and then you can do this activity with us. If you don't have the time now and you want to take a little bit more time, you're welcome to continue this in your own time. Okay, so
so we had Detroit said that in his culture, or her culture, we hongi, is that how you pronounce it? Touch noses and breathe at the same time, or we kiss each other on the cheek. A few other people said it sort of depends on the context and the person and how well they know them, whether it's personal or work. We had a few of those comments. No physical contact, tend to greet with a smile. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Melanie, for sharing, and for those online for sharing those thoughts as well and your own experiences. I think we can agree that it's quite varied. And again, with this exercise, you'll see that, if you had to compare this afterwards, which I'm not going to ask you to, but it would be very varied. So it's about your experience and how you do, how you basically develop your culture over that time. So for activity 1, I'm just going to introduce this. And as I said, it could be a work in progress. But what I found really useful is when you think about yourself, it's not just, okay, my name is so-and-so and I grew up here and there. It's really about going a little bit deeper. So I want to challenge you, and no one needs to know what's going on to that paper. It's a personal, individual activity. But thinking about your ethnicity, which could be straightforward. Maybe for some, you might feel, oh yeah, that's easy. I'm from this culture. But if you are, from maybe a mixed ethnicity, a background or family structure, what I always tell my students is really, which one do you feel most comfortable with, or do you associate with most? Some people might have, you are born into a specific ethnicity, but you, through time, because of experiences maybe abroad or changes in the family structure, you might even feel as if you are rotating closer to another ethnicity. So does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So that's one of the questions. Another one would be gender. Which gender you mostly associate with. Think about your family structure as well. Are you the middle child, the oldest, the youngest? Maybe it's a modern family, you might have grown up in one structure and then it changed. How did that change your position in the family? Also think about whether you played sports at school. Team sports, individual sports. That could have quite an impact on how you see the world or some of the experiences that you might have had. Your education, what's the highest level? It's one question, but where did you get your different qualifications? Each of those will have a different school of thought that would influence how you think today. So think about these things, and we can go on for a very long time. I've got a very long list of questions that I could ask you here, but just keep that in mind and keep that going. I've got this here as one way also of thinking about it, whether you, maybe it's a second or a third generation that immigrated. That could also have an impact on how you see the world in which you live today. And then also geographic location. We know that Eskimos have so many different words to describe snow. Or when you live in the desert, in a place where there's lots of camels, there might be lots of different ways to describe camels and lots of different words that you use for it. So that could also have an influence on how you think and how you express yourself. Are you finding this useful? I don't want to go too fast. Yeah. Everybody online okay as well? Are you finding this useful? Oh, good. Well, as I mentioned, this is really just the beginning. So go and unpack all of this, because this will help you to understand some part. It's at least the starting point to understand your position in life. Okay, and your lens. Okay, so that leads to the next one. So we've touched briefly on positionality, and I'm sorry I had to go through that so briefly, because again, we can go much deeper and there's a lot more that I can share on that topic. But it leads to cultural intelligence and how to develop this. Now, there's lots of different models out there, but this is a very useful one. It's the 4 pillars. And first of all, you have to be mindful of that, have that self-awareness. So it's thinking how you think. Thinking how you think. How did I get to that point? Why am I doing it this way? And actually asking yourself those questions. So metacognition is really about thinking how you think. And if you don't understand how you think and how you perceive or what you expect, then it's going to be hard to interpret if someone else is actually coming from a different angle or wanting to do something different. Then cognition is that, willingness to change a bit of the neuroplasticity, wanting to get more information, also the taking into consideration that things could be different from your own. And then the motivation to keep going, to adapt, to absorb, to not necessarily change. You don't have to change, and you don't have to change someone else to be able to get along. It's really about just that understanding and to work around that and work with that. And then the resilience, the persistence, but also the confidence. If you don't know how you think, it might be difficult to actually understand how someone else thinks. And then, you know, you could actually lose yourself in that situation. Could actually, you know, forget who you are in that situation. And then your behavior will be how you actually try and adapt, not necessarily change, but in certain settings, you'll know you're not going to shake hands. You're actually going to do something different. So really thinking about how you could change your actions and reactions. So that brings us to the second activity. Here in an ideal world, I would have tables, and we'll have little groups, and you'll do this as an icebreaker activity. What's really useful of this when you have your multidisciplinary or multicultural teams is really just, it's a simple exercise. Everybody knows, or you would expect most people, and I'm again making an assumption here, everybody knows flowers. What you are going to draw necessarily might be something different. Do you need more paper? Do you want to draw a flower? Yeah, good. Okay, great. So what's interesting though is when you sit in your group and you ask maybe the team leader or someone else to draw a flower, it might look completely different, or they might start with the stem instead of the petals or even the core of the flower. So immediately that could be a bit of a challenge, you know, thinking, oh, they approach drawing a flower in a completely different way than what I thought it would look like. And then on each of these petals, you can have different exercises. If it's about understanding that you all have to work towards a common goal for the project, it could be for, you know, you could ask them, okay, each team member get a petal of the flower, write what's important for you to achieve through this project. And there could be a lot of different ones then, you know, maybe each team member will identify something different. But it's important that you then talk about that so that you can come to a, you know, a common goal for the middle, the core of the flower. And that's just a simple exercise so that people can see, okay, we've got all of this not in common, it's different, but this is what binds us together. This is what all of us want to achieve in this project. Or it could be personality-wise, you know, different things that they don't know about you in the team. And then you share that, but then you say, okay, but this is what we are striving towards as a team. So that's a simple exercise just to bring people together in one flower. Okay, so I'll just run a little bit faster with this. How am I for time? Good? Yeah? Okay, thanks. So I'll wrap up with strategies. So that's the next one. So we've got the cultural intelligence pillars. There's a lot of theory, and I'm not going to bore you. It's not that kind of class. This is a masterclass. We are all going to have a good overview of all of these concepts. But for those of you that want to go a little bit deeper, and I'm only going to show you two of the most popular ones after this. But here's really a quick snapshot of some of these ways in which you can actually make sense of it theoretically if you are doing like a research paper or you are setting this up for a project. And if you want to focus on the differences by, you know, almost analyzing the different cultures and then looking at, okay, so what's different? You can look at values that's different, or cultural dimensions, or even geographic areas. And there's a whole lot of different theories for that. Or you could cluster different cultures together, where they have a lot of similarities, and that could, and then you compare across different cultures. There's also, you know, in terms of cultural variables and kind of cultural metaphors. So there's a whole lot out there, and I don't have the time to go through all of that. But hopefully it will if you want to go back and you say, oh yeah, I want to look at differences or similarities. Let me look at this Hofstede guy. Maybe he's interesting. Yeah, he is quite an interesting professor, a Dutch professor, and very well known for cultural dimensions. So that's why I've got these two up here. It's really just a starting point for those of you that don't know if you are interested in this, but you just want to give it a go. And what's really easy with Hofstede, they've got the different dimensions looking at power, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term or short-term orientation, and indulgence. And what I've got here up on the screen is basically, it's Australia, Indonesia, Fiji is the blue one. And you can immediately see across these different cultures how it's different. But there's also similarities. So it's a good way just to get some idea of, okay, so we sit, you know, on a national culture level across the board, not the subcultures, not all the individual aspects, but at a national level, this is how it's seen as different cultures, you know, on these scales. I've added that link. It will take you to the Hofstede Insights website, which is really useful because they have an explanation of each of these dimensions, but they also have a bit of a country overview. So if you want to, you know, almost like when you go to the business.gov site and it gives you an overview of a country, well, there as well, on the different dimensions, they talk about different cultures. So which is quite useful as a starting point. Again, I have to emphasize that. So really useful tool, but the next one as well to think about strategies, to think about the globe study. Here, again, they focus on grouping cultures together that have a lot of similarities, but then they compare it against another cluster where there might be differences. So this wheel, you'll see that there's not a lot of Pacific Island nations involved in this. So that's a huge gap for future research. I think, you know, if they could really, and you'll also see that some cultures are actually split into different clusters. So there they start taking into account, you know, how you can basically look at the subcultures as well. So, but the main message is there's so many out there. It's good to know that you can use a mixture of all of this. One will probably not be enough to really go into the more deeper aspects. Okay, and that brings me to the last couple of slides. So communication, I mentioned communication is important for context. You need to know the context so that you can communicate well. And one, just maybe a bit of a takeaway, only 19% of the world can actually, they speak English as a first language. 19. So 19% of the global population speak English, only 6% speak English as a first language, 14% as a second language. So again, it challenges our assumptions. Again, it makes us aware that, you know, even though someone might speak English, it's my second language. And it's important then to try, and if you are going to be inclusive and you want to really make sure that everybody feels comfortable, to make it easier to get that message across, to make it easier in the environment and to take that into consideration. So one is to really talk clearly. Don't use as many abbreviations. As Australians, we do that all the time. I remember sitting in some, you know, meetings, and then it's like, I'm still unraveling the first one and they are on the fifth one. It's like, oh, I'm never going to get this done. So it's important to think about speaking clearly, but also speaking clearly in terms of what you say, rather, you know, use the full words. What's also important is to have a bit of a pause. Not, you know, even in English, if everybody's English speaking, you need a bit of a pause. You can't just process everything fast. So if you are translating back and forth, you need a bit of a pause just to get through, you know, interpreting and then making sense of it, and then it can be embedded. And then not repeat and say the same thing all the time, but rather have reinforcement, maybe notes, maybe information beforehand, have slides or something that can actually reinforce your message in a different way. And visuals are usually a very good way to do that. And then also, just avoid, that's what's different when you think about expressions or humor. Sometimes that's really hard to carry that over from one language to another and one context to another. So maybe if you know someone very well after a couple of meetings, then, it's easier to do that. But in the first meeting, maybe try and avoid colloquial expressions or something that could be context specific. Okay, and that's my last slide so that I can hand over to my esteemed colleagues. So the main takeaway is really be self-aware. Think about how you think about how you do things, think about what you don't know, and also be authentic. People can see if you are trying too hard or you're doing things and it's not coming from a good place. And then also this willingness, show a willingness to bridge the gaps, that even if you make mistakes or, you do something and it might lead to an uncomfortable situation, that you're trying to make it better, that you're actually willing to put in the effort and you've got the motivation to make it work. Be resourceful. Embed yourself in as much of the literature and experiences as possible, and then be persistent. So this is just another way to put all of this together. Know the rules, rehearse, in other words, try and try again, practice in real situations, immerse yourself, measure your process over time. If you have a good friend in that culture, maybe ask them, so how did I go this time? How did that work for you? And that's a good transition to hand over to my esteemed colleague, Salesh, who's waiting online. Here's some of the projects that I've been involved in. Here's Salesh. There I am, hiding away at the back, thinking I'm taller than what I am. Okay, well, thank you very much. Can we just hand over to Salesh?
Good afternoon, all of you. Thanks, Saskia. I was just now absorbed in what we were now talking. Really interesting. At this point, I would like to thank you and the team and ACPIR for inviting me to share some of my experiences while doing research. So, yeah, I've been trying to figure out now, and we've been discussing how shall we go around this. Just to start off, I mean, yeah, we can talk and talk. You have placed a lot of topics which can go for weeks alone. So I'll start with it in terms of, if you go to the next slide, that will, okay, no, yeah, so I'll just put one slide and then I'll try to talk for 10, 15 minutes in there. So I'll just put in there, understanding the undercurrents. Okay, so I'll talk more in terms of Pacific Island countries where I've been doing research. Undercurrent, basically what I'm trying to say is now, if you have to go for a swim now, and if the weather, if you see it's all calm, but as Saskia has shared one of the slides, we don't know what's happening underneath. Now, is it all good, okay? Is it deep? What's in there? The animals or the crocodiles or sharks, what's in there? So in terms of research and taking the cue from the social norms or the culture, what to expect? Expectations either way, or from you as a researcher, as well as the expectation of the communities now once you are out there. So when we talk about research and culture, then if you talk about now trying to understand certain community, they have the social norm. And the way I can define social norm is unwritten rules. Yeah, unwritten rules which is governing that particular society. So here we are as researchers going out to understand that community in order to assist or get some strategies to help them. And then we have this ethical consideration, the formal process at the university to go through to have that endorsed. Yeah, at times when I have those questions, you have this, as I've said, the norms, the unwritten rules, and you're trying to fill your ethical forms to have that endorsed. So at the end of the day, we need to have that understanding what are the cultures in that particular society. And as I've alluded now, that social norm is informal, implicit, and though it's there, the community, they accept and they abide by it, which now in terms which Saskia was describing, apart now the English terms or the English speaking, generally when we go to a community or even now when there's some government assistance given to the community, and then after official opening, there is sharing of gifts. There's sharing of gifts. In other context, now as civil servants, they are not supposed to accept gifts. Okay. So, I mean, no, it's not normal to accept gifts. So they have these cultures and the protocols in place in terms of expectation from the community, they would congregate or come to provide you information as a researcher. But now what is there for them? And in any ways, what is the benefit of that interaction? Moving on, in terms of protocol and acceptance. So going to a community, there are protocols in place. Now we have got the formal protocols. We do agriculture surveys. We go through the formal ministry processes, through the livestock offices, through the extension offices. And again, in terms of now the cultural and the traditional context, there are provincial councils. And that's how many of the researchers, they would want to go, understanding their cultures and how they can now be in there to be able to get the information they need. So I'll tell you an example. So through this provincial council, now there was a student just this year. Now he was due to go and do the research. He said, okay, he's going to go. And I asked him, has he asked about inform the village, one of the rural remote villages. And he said he has followed the procedures. So by the time he and the team arrived in there was another function happening. So what happened? They accepted him, and they knew the message was passed that somebody's coming for a discussion session. And they told him and the team that now they're part of the village and they have to now contribute to the commitment which was happening in the village. So it was just sort of 1.5 days. Once the function finished, then they were formally invited again to work. So some of the things, and they were able to blend in there because of those cultures. Now it's and then retaining would be a different story because it's just too fine in and we know that research, it's about time, it's about cost. In terms of doing research in if you say in Fiji, we have got 2 major ethnic groups. They are diverse to how you approach them. That's very important, trying to understand them. And once now the protocols are done, it's sort of most of your work, you may say, is done, because then you are accepted. And once you are accepted, then they will be able to share what they have. No, they need that particular confidence to get that. Saskia has said in terms of food, no, culture and food, no, Pacific countries, it's very much related. For example, some tribes and clans, they have their favorite food, be it fish or any of the fruit, or breadfruit or root crops, even taro. So it's there. They regard that it's theirs. And when you are in there, you spend a week or so trying to get to know and get the information for your research, get to know the culture, the way you eat. Now, you have to know, apart from the researches you do, that the types of research you want to do, you have to really understand how they do, how they behave, the way why they behave. Now they might take offense if you are eating food the way and they see it's not okay. So yeah, in terms of food, still in there, when we look at the names now, as mentioned, the English aspects. So if you're doing research, I relate to agriculture, for example, fruits. That's what I encountered. Most of the fruits and vegetables, even the animals, are introduced in the Pacific Island countries. They never had a native name, but now they have it, and it is sort of coined or recoined using that English word. So in terms of getting that languages across, you really, while they will be knowing the English, okay, they'll understand, they speak, but what you're trying to get, the correct information. For example, if you're doing fruits and vegetables, that's what we encountered. We wanted to know what they grow locally. So then, while designing the questionnaire, they had written apples. So yeah, so now people would think, yeah, does apple grow in the Pacific Island countries? And they listed a few, and it was on the top. So after discussion, then we realized that now there were other apples, custard apples, which have been introduced. So some of them saying, no, we don't want apples because it's important. So languages, the English and the terminologies now would shape, including the culture, how we do research in that particular surrounding or in that particular area or in that particular community. Few things. If you go in terms of now talking about silence, we can say silence means nothing or silence means a lot. In the traditional Pacific Island, hierarchy in the clans, when the chiefs are sitting in there, it is expected that the lower ones below the hierarchy would now keep quiet. So the dilemma would be then, now if they are silent, for a researcher, what that would mean. Even if they are not agreeing, still they will be silent. So there are a lot of whole host of things that happens around them or around that culture in trying to understand how to get the information. Some certain things, as I've said, in terms of acceptance, one way is the spokesperson, and the one who will be able to help you understand their cultures, even at times, or get your answers. If they are silenced, what does that mean? Yes or no? Yeah, so definitely in terms of culture, they would be knowing the English, understanding. We normally do is we put in the traditional language, the local language. In Fiji we do Hindi, and in ACPIR language to have or to get what we really want from them. So yeah, I can talk and talk, but I don't know how much time I have. I would just I would like to have questions and happy to provide whatever I know with this view. Thank you once again, and I would let the other speaker talk about the other aspects of this. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Celeste. That was really, really interesting and great to hear your perspectives and experiences. And I can see a lot of my own experiences and what I've learned along the way kind of reflected in what you're saying as well. So for my part of the presentation, I hopefully only take about 10 minutes. So hoping you can stick around for a few more minutes while I share my experiences, but if you need to get going, I also understand that as well. So I'm going to be sharing some of my own reflections and learnings from my work and research experiences from across about the past 7 years. And I'm framing these today as the 4 C's towards cultural intelligence. So just a little bit about me to start with. So I'm fairly early in my career, and particularly in the international development space. And I first got into international development through an ACR project working with Libby Swanepoel back in 2020. And this was a project based in Samoa, and it was a collaboration between UniSC and the Samoa Ministry for Agriculture and Fisheries. And these are just some of the photos from that project. So it was a mix of research activities where we looked at nutrition, and the roles of men and women in seaweed work. And then we also did some community development based work where we designed and implemented or delivered a capacity building project in one of the communities. So since then, I've also been involved in some other work across the Pacific, mostly still in Samoa and a little bit in Fiji. And then about a year or so ago, I started my PhD. And as Britt said, it's looking at partnership models between Australia and partner countries. So that includes countries in the Pacific, but also in Southeast Asia. And it's really within the international relations discipline, which is a bit of a new space for me as well. I also wanted to just highlight a few things out of my own positionality because it forms a part of how I've made sense of my experiences and what I'll share in my reflections today. So in particular, I want to acknowledge my position of privilege. So I'm very aware of the power dynamics that I bring as a middle-class white researcher, and especially as I engage in this international development space, usually from a position of privilege and usually as a donor partner. And so I'm continually confronted by my position within this dynamic. And so I've really been trying to strive to always improve how I engage and work in this space, and especially taking into account those enduring effects of colonisation that do exist within the North-South context that we typically work. So over the next few slides, I'm going to unpack these 4 ideas around cultural intelligence that have, I've just found really important for me in my experiences. So the first C is challenge your assumptions. So I'd like to share an example of where I challenged my assumptions and I applied a critical lens. And this also relates back to my positionality as well. So when I started in the seaweed project, I didn't really question why we worked the way that we do. So I simply accepted that the way it works is that the Australian government provides funding to ACR, who then commission a university to deliver a research project in the Pacific. But I do remember experiencing a tension between wanting to work in more horizontal and decolonizing ways, but I was also aware of this kind of unspoken power dynamic that existed that I couldn't really articulate at the time. And the light bulb moment came for me when I started my PhD. So I started to learn about the history of Australia's international aid system, which can be traced back to the end of World War II. And essentially, Australia's system of aid is really founded on the logic at the time, which was around the rich and developed countries assisting the underdeveloped. And so basically, it's a bit of a colonial legacy, and it's quite a vertical or hierarchical structure of working with other countries. And so I think learning this really helped me see how the history of the systems and the structures that we work in actually shape then how we engage in this international development space and how we work with our partners. So that's made me think a bit more critically about international development work. And I've been starting to question more about, well, how are projects funded and who makes those decisions? And what is the impact of those financial flows on our interactions with the people we work with? And so for me, recognizing that there is this kind of inherent colonial and vertical nature of this system that we work in, and acknowledging my position or our position as donors within that system has been a critical or crucial starting point for me for change. So I think that kind of touches on that process of neuroplasticity that Saskia spoke to as well. And then another aspect of challenging your assumptions, which Saskia also did touch on, is critically thinking about how we know and ways of knowing. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I've included a couple of resources that I've found useful. And I think they kind of tie into that idea of metacognition, so they can help you unpack some of those things around, how you know and why you think that way. And then the second dot point here is checking your biases. So how is your view of the country or the community that you're working with shaped by what you've read, by what you've learned at school, maybe even by what you see in the media or in movies? And I think even academic literature can often paint this kind of dire deficit-based picture of the communities or the countries we're working with, because that's what sells when you're trying to get something published. And I think that can create the white knight syndrome and this assumption that people are broken or helpless and need our help. And so as a researcher, particularly from a donor partner side, I think we need to be constantly challenging and questioning ourselves around this, and checking for potential blind spots. So the second C is to be curious. And I think it's really important to be genuinely curious about culture, to ask lots of questions because you want to understand, not because you want to change. So for me, being a newbie into international development and also working with Samoa for the first time was a benefit in that I felt I could be quite vulnerable and ask lots of questions without judgment. However, I do recognize that when you've been working in an area for a while, there is this kind of tendency to stop asking questions because there's this expectation that you should know. So I believe it's important to kind of embrace the idea that it's okay not to know and it's okay not to understand. So be vulnerable and be authentic and just keep asking questions, because the more you do learn, the more you'll keep challenging those assumptions and checking those biases. But also being curious in a respectful way is also what builds our connection and relationship with other people. And that's the fourth C, which I'll get to in a couple of slides. And then the third C is let go of control. So letting go of control for me was about realizing that I was a guest in the situation I was working. So I realized that I was working in and for a community as an outsider, and I really had no right to be there. Secondly, I think letting go is also about trusting our in-country counterparts and community. And that was definitely the case in Samoa for the Seaweed project. That was one of the things that really made that project a success. And I think as a sector, particularly in agriculture, we do pretty well at trusting our in-country counterparts because most of us rely on and value their guidance in our projects. And I think sometimes it can be easier to have that trust because they come from similar science backgrounds or perhaps educational experiences. But I think the area that we could all do better is actually trusting our community. So really letting go of that expert mentality and giving power to people and becoming facilitators of processes and change. And so the practical application of this is then in how we do our work. So as well as being aware of our positionality and challenging our assumptions, we also need to work differently. So we may not be able to change the system that we're in necessarily, but we can look at how we work. And so one way that we found really helpful in terms of giving that power to people and at the same time respecting culture was through using participatory approaches. So either co-production or co-design, or even methods like citizen science can be helpful. And then the last one is facilitating the human connection. So I think at its core, culture is what makes us human. So it's how we see and make sense of the world. And as I mentioned earlier, this particular C is linked back to that idea of curiosity. So it's about facilitating the human connection to foster curiosity. And it's really about, like I said before, seeking to understand, not to change. I really like the 3 cups of tea approach, if you're familiar with that, but it's essentially just around taking the time to understand. So it's slowing down, getting to know your partners or your community, your colleagues. It's understanding their culture, finding commonalities, but also celebrating your differences. And then, dare I say it, building a friendship. And I don't think we often use that term enough in professional settings. So it's really just taking time to do these things rather than just jumping in to the business end of things. And I recognise that that can be quite challenging, especially when you've got deadlines or accountabilities to funders and things like that. But it is something that I think is, you know, the glue or the key to some of this stuff. And this last photo I wanted to share is of myself and Sapeti. So Sapeti is the Principal Fishery Officer in Samoa. And this photo was taken towards the end of the seaweed project. So I'd gone over to Samoa just to be with the team while they delivered the program into community. And I had only met Sapeti through doing this project. So I hadn't known her before that. But we really built a professional relationship through the project. But I would say it became more than that. So we really built a friendship. So I actually shared my slides with Sapeti earlier this week to show her what I was going to present. And when she got to this photo, she commented on the fact that we were drinking Taula beers. And she joked that it could be 3 beers instead of 3 cups of tea. And she said, in Samoan, Taula means anchor. So she said this photo of us sharing a beer was very fitting because it was symbolic of anchoring or solidifying our relationship that we had invested in and built through the seaweed project. So I thought that would be a lovely way to finish this presentation. On that note, I'm going to finish there and I'll hand back over to Saskia to wrap us up.
Thank you, Courtney. Thanks, Salesh, as well online. I'm mindful of the time. We've got a bit of time for questions if there's anybody that wants to ask questions in the chat or in the room.
Hi, so thanks, Courtney and Saskia and my good friend Salesh. I just wanted to make the comment that I think you all presented everything in very positive terms. And I think obviously, well, these things should be presented in a positive light, but I would like us to maybe also think in a more critical sense in how we can improve the way we do intercultural research. And I was just having a conversation with some PhD students yesterday after our meeting, and we were talking how sometimes the structures and processes that we have from a research or a university level really hinder us doing the right things. So for example, even simple things like ethics procedures, where students are not allowed to travel or use their budget before confirmation, but how you're going to do actual co-design, how you're going to actually nail a research question that matters for a community if you don't travel before you even confirm. Things like that, things like using research budget to buy kava in the context of Fiji, or betel nut, or gift exchanges with communities. I don't know, I've sat in this same room, I think, in a long discussion with people saying that we shouldn't be paying people when we go to communities. We shouldn't be paying for food or accommodation, because that's a way of colonizing and putting us in a relationship where we give money to communities. But again, if you talk to communities, it's like this idea of romanticizing culture where people don't have needs. People don't need money to go and buy things and so on. So I think as a center, there's a lot that we can do to have these conversations in a way that actually changes the structures of how we do things, because otherwise, I guess we all do our best, but if we still have the same structures that are enforcing very negative cultural relationships with the work we do overseas as well. So yeah.
That's a really good point. I think I'll let you speak to it as well, Saskia, but definitely my experience when I went to Samoa, we wanted to give honorariums to the community participants for the last part of the project. And that was really challenging because we needed cash to do that, and just going through the processes of how do I get cash to actually take over to Samoa. And it wasn't like a disrespectful thing, like you said. That was a very culturally accepted thing to do, was to provide an honorarium, and an expected thing. But it was really, really tricky to do it. And I agree. I think some of the change, you can do a lot as an individual and as a researcher and practitioner, but you are still within a system. So yeah, an organisation or an entity like ACPIR could actually play quite a positive advocacy role to the broader university context, and even to funders like ACR and that kind of thing.
Salesh, are you there? Would you like to comment on that?
I heard what Danny is saying. Hi, Danny. Yeah, those are the things, but end of the day, it's time, shall we compensate? Because they take out the time, For example, now in terms of doing research in a community, while they have got certain things doing individually. For example, in a village, once a week, they will all in that village will come together, for example, for a meeting or clean the village and other things they do communally. And that's when probably researchers would go and have these sessions are invited. Now the people are invited in there. So it's the time taken, I mean, if you've taken a day, that means 1 week of work cleaning the village and other things are affected. So yeah, we can discuss on this here as we go along.
There's a comment in the chat from Aaron, just about the complexity of cross-cultural work and positionality, is that it can expose one's vulnerability when disclosing our profiles on a research paper in the review process, and the challenge of overcoming others' perceptions in trying to replicate the study.
I'll talk to that. Maybe just on the previous point, you're right, as an organization, there's probably a room to create a community of practice, which is not going to be one culture, but it could actually be taking, what's going to be workable for the whole range of stakeholders involved. So that's a very good point. Thanks, Danny. And then to the other question, I think it's not disclosing everything. It's more than a thought process that you have to be mindful of. So it's not about writing all of that into a paper, rather than before you even start a project, to be aware of maybe possible sticky points that could actually color your lenses, so it's important to be mindful of that. But you're right, how far do you need to disclose that exploration of your own position, and maybe vulnerability is a word that you've used. I don't know if do quite a bit of reviewing for cultural journals, and maybe I'm different, but I don't look at when there's a disclosure of reflection and disclosing some of these things that it's a bad thing. I actually look at it as a positive aspect of the paper, because it's really then deeper, and it's much more, it shows almost the professional development of the person going through the process. But I can't speak to, to all the reviewers and all the papers out there. But that's a good question. Thanks for raising that. Marta, can you maybe speak up? I'm sorry, I can't see the chat here, but I can see your hands raised.
Okay, I'll lower it now. I think it was somewhere on the beginning, I think it was Saskia who mentioned the GLOBE project about mapping cultural clusters. And there was a mention of the Pacific not being very well represented in this work. Can you please elaborate on that, and what is the potential to actually get stuck into mapping the Pacific?
That's a good question. Thanks, Marta. Well, the GLOBE study is done annually, basically, and in every second year, you'll see that there's an update, and it's around clusters of either geography or language, that they have that as similarities for those countries that they cluster in one group together. But there's not a lot of information, even for Hofstede's Insights, the previous one, on Pacific Island perspectives and where they sit on the dimensions in Hofstede's work. So I think there's a lot of room for research, and it might not be a research project on its own, but really just to look at these models and theories that's just, again, maybe very westernized in a lot of ways. And Hofstede is done every year. And they also incorporated Asian cultures after, I can't remember the year, but then they started, and that's where long-term and short-term dimensions and so on, they added that. But it's a good question, how to go about to make a lot more of the information known about the Pacific Island. And that could be Polynesian, Micronesian, a lot of different dimensions that could be taken into account. So yes, hopefully it's something that those of us that do research or that want to do research in that space, make that part of your projects. See if you can challenge the conventions that everybody's just, taking for granted as a model, as the dimensions. Maybe there's more dimensions that needs to be added to these. It should be an evolving model because cultures also evolve over time. So yeah, that's a good conversation to be had, I think. Thanks, Marta. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
If we don't have any questions, let me jump in and say a very big thank you. Maybe I'll stand over here. Apologies. A very big thank you to our 3 ACPIR researchers presenting today. Thank you, Saskia, Courtney, and Salesh, sharing your insights today. How wonderful to get an overview of the theoretical framework, as well as the lived experience, and yeah, a wonderful example from our research project in the Pacific. So thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us in the room and online. Wonderful to see some new faces. If you've enjoyed today's seminar and would like to be added to our mailing list, please pop a comment or come see us after. Send us an email, of course, acpir@usc.edu.au. You'll be the first to hear about other events, masterclasses, and more. Otherwise, we hope to see you in our 2024 seminars and masterclasses and events then. Thank you.